Okay, well, welcome back. I would like to introduce you to our responder this afternoon, Mary Lu Redden, who I had the pleasure of meeting just a few minutes before Dr. O'Brien's paper. Mary Lu has done graduate work in philosophy. She has received an honorary doctorate from the University of King's College, is the former director of Halifax Humanities, as you see in your program. But the one thing she wanted me to make sure to say to everybody, one thing you should know about her is that she's a very proud grandmother. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mary Lu.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you to the committee for asking me to take on this interesting assignment. It was unexpected and I wasn't quite sure where to go with it. So I was quite literally running off madly in all directions. And I had extensive email conversations with Peter about, I'm going in this direction, this direction, this direction. And he provided wonderful guidance and was extremely helpful to me and very patient. So I'm glad about that. So this is really going to, what I have ended up with is a rather sort of personal reflection on some of the themes that came out in Thucydides and Lucretius. It won't be quite as wonderfully scholarly and dense as Peter's presentation was, but I'm going to riff a little bit on some of the things that came out. So I want to start with just two little episodes from my own life that will, I think, show relevance as I go. The first was that when I was about 11 years old, I read sections of Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. It was odd reading for a child that age, but I think that I had a sort of fascination with the idea of societal collapse, and in part because I'm of the generation that grew up with the threat of nuclear war. I was 9 years old when the Bay of Pigs crisis happened, and Sarnia, Ontario, where I lived, which is just 60 miles from Detroit, was filled with air raid sirens. And so we were taught how to duck under our desks in the event of a nuclear attack, which led me to come to the conclusion that adults and their advice was just nonsense, because I knew that I wouldn't survive a nuclear attack, especially in a city filled with petrochemical plants. It seemed unlikely. So when I read Defoe, I was very, very struck by the idea of social collapse as a child. This terrified me. And the episode that terrified me the most, really, was one in which a healthy young pregnant woman was attacked and possibly raped by a man who, in Defoe's words, had the plague upon him. When this man finished the assault on the woman, he told her that he was plague-ridden, and he said, "If I have the plague, why should you not have it too?" And as I was listening to Peter, I thought the idea of the blurring of boundaries between the living and the dead sort of came alive in that moment in Defoe, where someone could not bear to see someone alive and healthy, wanted to bring them down to their own level. So combined with Defoe's heartrending descriptions of cries of pain and grief coming from houses that were boarded up for quarantine purposes, where every inhabitant was doomed, that particular episode I mentioned is terrifying to me still. And so for this presentation, I reread parts of Defoe. Interestingly enough, it's become a bit of a hot book to get. Like at the Halifax Public Library, there's a very long waiting list. I was lucky to get the last copy at the Bookmark, which just tells you that it was the last copy. They had sold out. So already armed with existential dread as an impressionable youngster, I was primed to be terrified by thoughts of the plague. And here we are in the midst of a pandemic, a reality that I never thought I would actually experience. Now, there's one more little story from my life that I think will be relevant as well. When I was in my 20s in grad school, I spent a weekend with my most elderly aunt on my mom's side a very formidable, quite scary woman who had been born about 1905. Over the weekend, when I was visiting her, she told me about family history that I had never known. And she showed me pictures of ancestors from the Ottawa Valley Irish Catholic community that my family came from. And holding a picture of a lovely young couple taken in the late 1800s, she told me their story. They lived on a farm on Alumet Island in the Ottawa River. There was an outbreak of some potentially fatal, highly contagious disease, possibly scarlet fever or diphtheria, in their community. According to my aunt, this young couple, who had several children, decided that one of them needed to go to nurse a neighboring family stricken with the disease. My aunt described the conversation that she imagined them having. The father would have insisted that he go because if he died, then their children would still have their mother. The mother argued that she should go as the father would be better situated to provide for the children should she die. I was very taken with the idea of this conversation. And while I can't remember whether or not my aunt told me of the final decision and outcome, I do recall feeling a sense of pride in being the descendant of people who would have such a strong sense of duty and compassion. As I've been thinking about how to respond to Peter's paper, these two incidents have stood out in my mind, reading Defoe at a young age and then the story of my ancestors, and left me with two central questions. Does an outbreak of uncontrollable illness always lead to a breakdown of civil society? And within that terrible context, what motivates those who do their duty and care for others in spite of the terrible risk to their own lives? Now, I should say first off that reading the short passages in both Thucydides and Lucretius and then revisiting Defoe has been oddly comforting. And as Peter was going through the descriptions in Lucretius, my husband whispered to me, well, COVID's not so bad, is it? And there's a lot of truth to that, that when you read about plague as it was in London in 1645, 55, or you read about bubonic plague, smallpox, the 1918 influenza, COVID is really not as bad as those. It is bad, and it's been a source of great suffering, but it isn't the sort of immediate death sentence that those other plagues have been. And we haven't experienced the breakdown of civil society, at least in Canada, that characterized those ancient plagues and the London plague. So I'm very grateful that my worst fears have not come true. In order to prepare for this, I began to go down some pretty wild internet rabbit holes, and I want to share a little bit of what I stumbled across in those journeys. In discussing plague in Homer and Sophocles, Peter says, the plague is therefore an expression in the natural sphere and by divine causality of disorder and imbalance in the ethical and communal spheres. So I thought I would search online for material about the attitudes of churchgoers to the COVID pandemic. And it turns out that there are very many people who feel that these difficult times are in fact a punishment by God for various ills in society. I'll just mention a very few things that I came up with. So for instance, in a study done in 2020 by Queen's University Belfast, along with a sort of interchurch group, pastors reported many parishioners who believed that the pandemic was God's judgment for sin. And the specific sins that they mentioned were the relaxation of abortion laws, the granting of rights to LGBTQ plus individuals, and the permission to open pubs on Good Friday. So those were the particular sins that people felt God was punishing people for in Ireland. From an article in the Atlantic on April 24th, 2020, the writer Jonathan Merritt says that pastors in the US were saying that all natural disasters can ultimately be traced back to sin. And he mentioned as well a survey done that April that concluded that 40% of Americans saw COVID as a wake-up call and signs of coming judgment. I went on the website of one conservative Protestant pastor, Terence Ascott, And this is what he laid out as the Christian responses to the pandemic. And he has 4 of them. The first is those who see these days as the end times, with the pandemic being just another sign of and heralding the imminent return of Christ. Then he talks about those who see the pandemic as a great opportunity to share the gospel, because with people thinking about death, they would be more open to a message of salvation. Then he talks about those who take a purely Old Testament view, as he calls it, and see the pandemic as God's judgment on a sinful world, one that has lost all moral judgment. And finally, he describes Christians who reflect on and lament over the age-old problem of why good people suffer. Or as Psalm 73 puts it, the wicked flourish and the righteous are crushed under their feet. So that's just one conservative Protestant pastor summing up what he saw as possible responses to the pandemic. Interestingly, though, in the American context, some preachers, and perhaps especially those with lucrative televangelism and stadium-sized churches, they stood to suffer from the closing of churches. And so many of them took their lead in thinking about the pandemic, not so much from scripture, but from the previous incumbent of the White House, and have claimed COVID to be a hoax, or at worst, a bad flu. And a great example of that would be the televangelist Kenneth Copeland. If you're not familiar with him, it might be interesting to see how he blew COVID away and destroyed it with his breath. And another example is Jim Baker of Jim and Tammy Faye, who was selling fake cures for COVID until the government caught up with him. But I would say that from my rather random survey of the idea of COVID as divine punishment, for the most part, religious people have not gone that route, understanding COVID rather in scientific terms as a highly contagious viral disease and nothing more. But I had to ask myself, is there a connection between this pandemic and what Peter described as disorder and imbalance in the communal and ethical spheres? And I think that there is a connection. COVID may not have come upon us as a consequence of a disordered society. It's not been caused by disorder in society, but certainly its impact has been worsened by social injustice. Just to give one example, a recent article in Scientific American by an author named Rachel Newer claims that universal health care could have saved more than 330,000 American lives during COVID. According to the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, people in the United States without proper health care mostly don't have a family doctor, as is true for 10% of Nova Scotians, and therefore many people are living with untreated diabetes, high blood pressure, and other conditions that make them more susceptible to dying from COVID. In addition, the article says that people without a primary care physician are likely to wait longer to seek medical help if they are feeling ill. And if that illness is COVID, then they will spread it to more and more people. Prior to the pandemic, 28 million Americans had no health insurance. 9 million lost their employment-based health coverage when jobs were lost because of COVID. And in April of 2021, NBC News reported that personal medical debt in the United States had risen to $2.8 billion in 2020 alone. 21.4 million Americans report having medical debt that they will never pay off. So COVID really has been worse because of that kind of unjust sort of healthcare system. We've probably all seen reports on how COVID was more rampant in overcrowded housing situations, in meatpacking plants, in warehouses. It's pretty clear that people in poverty, people working at low-paying jobs, people who have to serve the public in stores, restaurants, pubs, people who had no option to work from home and had to take public transit everywhere were more likely to be exposed to the virus. In other words, the disorder in our economic system, where billionaires got so much richer during the pandemic, while those in economic distress suffered more, has in fact been a factor in the virulence of this pandemic. So perhaps we can say as Peter did, that our pandemic is an expression of disorder and imbalance in the ethical and communal sphere. I would like now to get a little bit fanciful. And I'm taking my cue from what Peter described as Lucretius' more metaphorical take on the situation in Athens as described by Thucydides. And I just want to sort of highlight certain aspects of our current situation as I have experienced them. Three things stood out for me, particularly in Lucretius' very poetic account of the Athenian plague. In describing those who were struck with illness, as we just saw, he mentions many symptoms, and I want to draw attention to three of those. So these are Lucretius words. I don't know if it's exactly the translation that Peter used, but it's close. So one thing that Lucretius said was, the tongue, interpreter of the mind, oozed pus and made limp with the smart, was too heavy to move and rough. And then the second thing that Lucretius said was, at that point, there were many other signs that death was near. A mind that was deranged with melancholy, mad with fear, is how he describes a sufferer of the plague. And then he goes on to say, some fell into a deep forgetfulness and lost all store of memories and did not know their own selves anymore. So I've broken this down into three things that, or three ways for me to look at the COVID pandemic we're living through. The first is communication then, the second is melancholy, and the third is memory. So communication. We haven't all had COVID. I've been fortunate I haven't had COVID, but in a sense, we've all had COVID, and we've all had it with COVID too, I think. Our society has COVID. We have all endured deprivation in a number of ways, and communication with others has been part of that deprivation. Now that I am retired, I haven't had to do very much on Zoom. I know many of you have taught for almost 2 years now, largely on Zoom. The little that I have done, including teaching 4 classes for my former work, Halifax Humanities, has been somewhat awkward and uncomfortable. It is a rough form of communication. And I'm sure that everyone here has a host of stories of Zoom meetings gone awry. I'm involved in 3 different book groups, and my worst Zoom moment was in a book club where the ladies are all quite a bit older than me. They appreciate my youthful take on things, and I'm almost 70, so that gives you some idea of how old they are. One of the members in that group was sitting in a swivel office chair during our Zoom meeting with an iPad on her lap and did not understand the nature of Zoom and that form of communication. And she kept swiveling around, so much so that the rest of us began to actually feel dizzy. And we had to stop her and say, could you please go and put the iPad on a table and sit still, because we were beginning to feel nauseated actually at this Zooming thing that she was doing. Now, I am thankful that there are things like Zoom and FaceTime. During the first lockdown, our little grandson was only 6 months old, and our son and his wife got into the habit of setting up a computer and having dinner with us. Which was wonderful. And for some reason that we have yet to figure out, they still do it. We live in an 11-minute walk away from them, but every night at supper time, we hear the bing, 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 and there they are again, and they want us to watch them eat supper. We love it. It's quite fun. Our grandson lasts about 3 or 4 minutes, takes a few bites of something and runs off to play. But anyways, it's kind of fun. And I've seen more of some of my older friends during this period of the pandemic than I have for years, because a group of us who've known each other for 47 years formed a little study group, and we live all across Canada from coast to coast, and yet we see each other every 3 weeks. So that's been quite wonderful. So in many ways, Zoom is something to be truly grateful for, but it is an awkward form of communication. And that lack of in-person contact has affected us all. In spite of what Zoom and other technical means have provided, just think of all those simple conversations with a neighbor, sitting in a coffee shop with a friend. These are only now beginning to be part of our lives again. I think that those 2 years without that kind of contact has caused a lot of suffering. I wonder if it's perhaps even sort of lessened our ability to be sociable. I'm not sure. The second thing where Lucretius talks about the mind that was deranged with melancholy, I think in it here again, COVID has created melancholy. In a Kaiser Family Foundation tracking study conducted last July, 53% of American adults reported that worry and stress related to coronavirus has had a negative impact on their mental health, up from 39% prior to COVID. The stressors in the beginning of the pandemic that had the most impact were seeing family less, the travel restrictions, the death of someone close, just the challenges of trying to work, trying to find childcare, people feeling alone, losing a job, financial difficulties. So many things have created for people a tremendous sense of sadness and loss in their own lives. We may not be deranged with melancholy, as Lucretius describes it, but obviously I think we all need to be sensitive to how much sadness this pandemic has caused. When I was a teenager studying Latin, and we did little bits of the Aeneid in Latin class, and I picked up on an expression that has become one of my favorite sort of expressions in life, and that was Aeneas says, "Sunt lacrimae rerum," which I translated, and I hope it's okay. There are tears of things. And I have never felt that more than in the past 2 years, that there's a kind of sadness in the world. Those who have directly experienced loss, those of us who have seen others experience loss, it has been a sad, sad time. The third thing is memory. And I may be only describing my own experience here as an aging retired grandma, but I think that the pandemic has taken a toll on my level of concentration and my memory. It could just be aging, and the fact that I don't have the focus as a retired person that I had while I was working. But and I don't know if anyone else feels it, I sometimes feel myself to be in a fog as to how much time has passed in this pandemic. I honestly think that if it weren't for our grandson and watching his growth and those milestones, I would not know what year I'm in, what month I'm in at all. I recall in March of 2020, when the first lockdown was imposed, thinking, okay, this is a challenge. It will last about a month. We'll get through it. We managed to get some toilet paper, which was such an issue at the start. Who knew that over 2 years later, COVID would still be such a presence in our lives and doesn't seem to be going away as much as we would like. When I think of the world before COVID, my entire 68 years of life before COVID, I think of now as the before time. And sometimes it almost feels as if there never was a world without COVID. I actually have dreams about being places, significant places from my childhood, such as the beach on Lake Huron, where I grew up, and all of a sudden waking up in a panic going, nobody had a mask on, and feeling scared. I see a scene in a movie where people are gathered together in a large place, chatting, and it's crowded. And my first thought is, they don't have their masks on. I'm pretty addicted to the mask, as you can see. Another way I think in which COVID has affected memory for me is that it has been a reminder of how forgetful we've become, at least in Canada, that the luxury of living with both vaccines to prevent illness and therapeutics to treat illness is new in human history. I have vague recollections of seeing older children in my school when I was quite young who wore leg braces because of polio. Polio was still an issue when I was born in 1952. I also remember a kind of excitement at my school when I was 9 years old because we were all going to be immunized with the liquid drop form of the polio vaccine. And there just seemed to be almost a joyousness in the school and I think amongst our parents. Our collective, COVID rather, has been a reminder that not all epidemic illnesses can be forgotten as if they never existed. Our collective confidence that we privileged people in industrialized nations have conquered terrible diseases, I think has been shaken, at least for me it has. While preparing to write this reflection, I got interested in the story of the polio vaccine in Canada, and I read a short history entitled Conquering the Crippler, Canada and the Eradication of Polio, published in 2005. And this is one of the things that it says in the beginning of that little booklet. Today, most Canadians have forgotten it all. The illness, the suffering, and death caused by infectious diseases in this country. Because we have forgotten how polio, for instance, affected individuals and communities, we have become complacent about its continuing impact on others around the world and its ongoing threat to us all. So COVID has been a wake-up call to remind us of how privileged we have been to live in an era when so many preventable or so many illnesses have become preventable illnesses. That's a tremendous thing. The pandemic has affected memory in a very tangible way for seniors in care, especially those with dementia. Our younger son works for the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia. And when I just sent him a little note saying, has the pandemic worsened the effects of dementia on those in care? He just said, oh, Mom, you have no idea. He said, I could give you pages and pages and pages of information on how the pandemic has affected the ability of people just to socialize, to connect with relatives, to do group activities. It's really taken a toll on those with dementia. Now, I mentioned the story of my aunt and my ancestors earlier, because both that story and all the readings that I've been doing about plagues have left me with the question of moral courage. Both Lucretius and Thucydides, as well as Daniel Defoe, talk about those who risked their own lives to care for the sick. I don't imagine that I'm alone in wondering if I would have that courage. Thucydides, as Peter mentioned, speaks of those who, and I quote, made it a point of honor to act properly. Some people felt ashamed to think of their own safety and went into homes where there was plague and attended to the sick. Lucretius speaks of this courage with the following words: those who did attend the ill, on the other hand, and in brackets, their sense of duty left no choice, compelled by pleas for pity, mingled with reproach's voice, contracted the disease, run down by labor without rest in the sick room. And that's how death took the noblest and the best. Defoe also talks about those who responded with charity to the sick and dying. At one point in his narrative, he writes these chilling words about fear of death from the plague. He says, this I say, the plague took away all compassion. Self-preservation indeed appeared to be the first law. And he then describes children abandoning sick parents, parents abandoning sick children. But later on in the narrative, he writes about the, I quote, charitable assistance that some pious people daily gave to such as were ill, sending them relief and supplies, both of good, physic, and other help as they found they wanted. Defoe speaks about the temper of the people of the day to give very generously to the London government for the relief of the impoverished and sick. And indeed, he continues, some pious ladies were so transported with zeal in so good a work, and so confident in the protection of Providence in discharge of the great duty of charity, that they went about in person distributing alms to the poor and even visiting poor families, though sick and infected in their very houses. So for the ancient thinkers, to the extent that I understand them, honor seems to have been the motivation for risking their own health. For the Christians in London in 1665, as described by Defoe, compassion was accompanied by a faith in providence, a sort of assurance of protection. Now, I will never know if the story about my ancestors on Alumet Island is true, nor will I ever know what motivated them to risk their lives to help others, if in fact they did so. And I always have to remind myself with any family story that I am from a long line of Irish Catholic storytellers who never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So I'm never entirely sure that story's true, but I found it inspiring. In the midst of immersing myself in plague material for the past month, I must say that it has been both a comfort and a jolt to the conscience to hear of those who helped in the ancient world, in mid-century London, and in our own time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have some time for questions, comments, discussion. Dr. Robertson.
Thank you. Those were a lovely talk and a wonderful response. Maybe for both of you, but I think you could pick Peter, your talk. I'm wondering if you would. I'm mindful of the way in which each of your four examples about plague can be seen in a way, what's the function of plague in those narratives? And in some sense, it's to reveal a kind of false assumption, which is often connected to a kind of hubris. And I'm thinking about that in relationship to Agamemnon and his beliefs about his capacity to sort of just claim objects of war as belonging to him, or Oedipus and his belief in his own rational self-governance and his governance. I'm mindful of the fact that, and this is the point that I learned from others, that in Thucydides, the plague, if I recall, comes directly after Pericles' funeral oration, which can be seen to be this statement of the glory of Athens, that in a way we can even teach the gods how, and then we see the plague destroying everything that Pericles was, so even though there's not a causal connection, there seems to be a literary connection or a narrative connection. And then equally with, in the case of Lucretius, the plague is revealing the false belief that non-Epicureans have about the nature of life, their failure to grasp its fundamental materiality, and therefore our liberation in relationship to the distinction between life and death. Is that?
Yeah. So when I was driving up yesterday, I listened to a podcast. It was an ideas show on Thucydides in two parts, and one of the presenters made your point and the point I was trying to make as well perfectly, saying that apocalypse, which literally means taking the veil off or revealing what was there, applies to these ancient disasters because it shows what's really there by peeling back the veneer. And I think that does work for a reading of all four, even though there's a very different emphasis in each case. And for Thucydides, I said it wasn't metaphor for him, and it isn't, but it tends very, very closely to that. Like that seems to be his thing. For Lucretius, I think it's deliberately, a kind of therapeutic metaphor that we're supposed to puzzle over and understand. Yeah. And the podcast also quoted Michelle Obama, said something, I wish I could remember properly, but it's, pandemic reveals true character, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Do you think, I don't know if this applies or not. One of the things I found so difficult is to sort of articulate, make some sense of this event in a way that has form and content. And it's also struck me that it seems we are weirdly inarticulate about plagues. One way that shows, I think, is how we sort of had to remember that there was a Spanish flu in 1918 when like millions and millions of people, but it seems to have just sort of disappeared. Another thing that struck me, and I might be wrong about this, there'll be people in this room who might be able to tell me if I'm wrong, but it struck me that Shakespeare, who lived through several, doesn't mention them at all. Like it's quite odd, right? That it would seem. I mean, Lear was written during the plague. Is there something about? I mean, and I've noticed it too that it seems easier to and interesting, Peter. It shows actually in this sense, and it may just be that but in both Oedipus and Ithilien, I'm like, of course, the plague. They're right, it's right there in plain sight, but I never think they're about plagues. I always think they're about rage or self-knowledge or something like that. There something, do you think there is something about plagues that is actually uniquely difficult for us to speak about?
I'm sure you're right. I'm just trying to think if there's anything in the sources I was dealing with. I mean, Thucydides makes a great point of setting everything down in detail because he thinks it's important that it not be forgotten. So maybe, I don't know, Mary Lu, if you have anything to add.
Well, I recently read a book called The Great Silence by Judith Nicholson. She's the granddaughter of Vita Sackville West. And she writes about the years after both the First World War and the influenza epidemic. And she just talks about it being collective forgetting, that nobody in England, at least, and she goes through all of the levels of society, wanted to talk about it. It was as if we've survived it, let's get on. And I was very interested. A cousin of mine sent me a memoir written by my English grandfather. I do have some English in me, thank God. And my grandfather was in England, lived in England with my grandmother, and my father was born there in the period from 1918 to 1920. And in that little memoir that my grandfather wrote, there's not a mention of the epidemic at all. And it must have affected them. I mean, so many people in England died. And it's just like, let's get over it. I don't know. I wonder how we will be in a few years if we get out of this, or when we get out of this. Will we just want to shake it off? And it will take maybe a generation to reflect again. Is that always the way to suffering?
It's compared to war. I mean, war seems to last. The memory of war is something very rare.
I often wonder if it's the second generation that talks about war. That the people who actually lived through it don't. Men who were in the Second World War didn't talk about their wartime experience much, because as they got older and their children might have asked, that they then went back and had stories. I don't know, but I just wonder. Forgetting is as much a part of trauma as experiencing trauma.
I think what you just said is probably quite true, that I'm a connection with my kids. We might be even worse about forgetting everything we've learned in the last couple of years in this one. Every time when it started, I think everybody said, "Oh, it's going to change everything." It's the 9/11. Pissed off how many you know, really superficial changes happened, but it didn't change the world. Right? We want that to normal as quick as it could. And we're ready to do it. But we said about war. My dad was the Second World War veteran. The only stories I've heard from him about war were he was an innovator, you know, getting drunk was stealing a Jeep, he's an Italian girl, that kind of never anything about the actual fighting. First time I met somebody whose dad had talked about actual fighting. He was a Lutheran pastor taking me to my seminary court, not my seminary, kind of course I was in. And he had talked about it. And I suspect well, that he gave testimony to people in England that had talked about it. Here, you know, I figure my dad might have flown up to another planet, fight the war, come back, and then get on the flight, get over it, or talk about it. Say they think they're, you know, talking to each other about it. But in Europe, it would be right there. You know, it's pretty close to us. And it did another 3 months probably with that active stuff on our those shores, but because I think the forgetting is probably unfortunately, because I don't think we learn anything. You know, like people say the world changed. Well, what do we learn? So very, very, very.
Sort of enter into your popular parlance in the way that elderly relatives, when I was a child, would talk about polio or Spanish influenza or something. I think that's the way, you know, Shakespeare uses plague just as turns of phrase. When he says, hey, plague about your house, or boils to you, and all that sort of stuff, right? I think the only time he mentions the plague is in Romeo and Juliet, right? Prior Lawrence has to go outside of Mantua, and that's not in England, one, and two, he's just saying something about the way the Franciscans travel around. So I just think it enters into your Jerry sort of defines, you know, often we don't want to talk about it, but it just becomes part of our collective memory.
On the other hand, about the Second World War, I mean, there was lots of discussion and reflection for decades later about, you know, the social and political things that had happened to lead to the war and all those kind of things. But
we probably over-examined ourselves during this pandemic in a way that no one else probably is.
Right.
Question.
Just a weird thought that just passed through my head. In both the Iliad and in Oedipus, plague initiates the drama, and in Lucretius, plague ends the work. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about that. It seems as if, you know, those earlier ones, the plague is the way in which the divine is marking its displeasure with the human world. And it seems that in a way, the plague coming at the end of the Lucretius may be a kind of test, you know, of, you know, if the Lucretian philosophy can handle plague, it's liberated itself from that older, I don't know.
No, I think that's it. So in Homer and in Oedipus, you have that sort of integrated cosmic understanding of how everything hangs together. And really the solution to the problem is there at the beginning. You just have to reconcile yourself with the cosmos, basically. The polis is still there at the end of Oedipus, even though he gets exiled, and even though Achilles is going to die, there's an accommodation at the end. But with Lucretius, I think he is being subversive, and he's holding up that example and leaving a ragged end as a kind of test for his Epicurean learner. And I think he probably is suggesting that things need to be built up. You know, everything has dissolved. All of the forms of civil relationship, even family in a way, you know, it sort of remains. And that image of the family kind of accords with his view of the social contract that he presents earlier in the poem. So maybe there's some clue to how things will be built up again. But yeah, no, I think that's right. And with Thucydides, it's just there, and history goes on. He ends his history abruptly too, you know. So,
Is that a question or comment? Otherwise,
I'm just wondering, in view of what Paul said, his response, and what he said was the classical tradition, do you see a difference between the Judeo-Christian tradition where Job demands to know what God's up to, and even in our Christian era, how can God allow these things to happen? Whereas with so more so with Greeks and Romans, that this is all just, well, God's playing with us, and maybe we do deserve this. Is there a parallel between the two traditions, or are they one?
well, I mean, this is just my speculation, so others can probably help. But I think there's the most immediate comparison would be in Homer's world, you know, where the plague comes because Apollo is angry, you know, and there are special interests involved. But I think Lucretius is actively battling against what he views as, you know, the impossibility of providence in the end, right? I mean, if there's no divine interest, if there's no fate, there's actually no providence, and what you're left with is individuals who have it incumbent upon them to achieve a tranquility of mind in the face of that terrible weight that's on them, with having no faith in providence or anything to save them other than their own liberation by you know, understanding the way things are according to the atomic theory.
Coming out of some period of stability of the Roman republics, and their comes into this chaos which is caused by personal ambition.
He sees it, you know, fear of death, sexual love, and ambition. Those are three great obstacles to tranquility of mind for him. And I think they're all, with the exception of sexual love, they're all evident in that plague description. Two of them anyway.
well, we've been together now for over 2 hours. Instead of using my chairmanly privilege of asking questions, I am tempted to, but I won't.